Well, good morning. Great to see all of you. Thank you for being here. If you'd like to open your Bible back up to Mark chapter 1, I'm going to read 3 verses from that text again this morning as we get into our lesson. As you're turning there, let me just welcome visitors. We have several with us this morning. We've got the Fishers and Bernice Archer back with us visiting again. Of course, they used to be members here, and so they're not really visitors, but we're glad to have them back with us today. We have a young lady with us this week. Back in May of this year, our daughter, Kinley, participated in a academic competition over in North Carolina, and another competitor in that opportunity, Cora, a young lady from Houston, Texas. She also was a competitor in that, and she and Kinley became close friends that weekend, and so she's here spending the week with us. And so if you see her, no, Ben and Stacy don't have another daughter, but we have a guest, and we're glad that she's with us. But I look around and I see lots of guests. Some of you here the first time, some of you have been here many times with us, and I'm just thankful that we can all be together today. Read with me Mark chapter 1 again from verse 40. And a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him and saying, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." And moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I am willing, be cleansed." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. We're going to look at this text again later in the sermon, and so I'm only going to comment on this portion of it right now. I love what this man says to Jesus in verse 40. If you are willing, you can make me clean. He has enough faith in Jesus to know that if he's going to be cured of his skin disease, Jesus has the ability to do that. And so he seeks Jesus. He comes to him in great earnestness. He is begging him. He falls on his knees, and he begs Jesus to heal him. This man who was unclean asks Jesus to make him clean. And I want us to think about those words this morning. Because when we go back to the Old Testament, especially when we go back to the books of Moses, and especially when we look at the book of Leviticus, which is your favorite book, right? There's a lot in that book about clean and unclean. We see those words a lot in the Old Testament. And those words, they teach us things. They help us understand concepts and ideas. And what I want to do with you this morning is to look at some examples of the usage of those words, clean and unclean, in the Old Testament. And let's see how those words and those ideas point us to Jesus. So I want you to start with me in Leviticus chapter 13. Leviticus chapter 13, let's go there. And let's first talk about when that which is clean becomes unclean. That's what we see happening in these passages in the Old Testament. Something or someone who is clean becomes unclean. And so some examples that I want us to look at this morning are found in the book of Leviticus. We're going to look at an example in the book of Numbers. But let's start right here in Leviticus as we think about this leper. The leprosy that we just read about in Mark chapter 1, well, that was something that made a person unclean according to the law of Moses. In Leviticus chapter 13, we're going to look at this, but before we read these verses, I want us to understand some things about these terms. In the Old Testament, particularly in this book, we read these words, clean, unclean. Let's throw in the word holy as well. And we read those terms, and we read about people and objects being considered by those terms. But we need to understand that these are terms that speak to the status or the condition of a person or an object. These terms do not generally have anything to do with sin. When we read about someone in the Old Testament being unclean, that is not synonymous with sinful. And conversely, when we read about someone being clean, that doesn't mean sinless. Now, there are parallels, and there are connections that we can make, but in this book, these words do not generally refer to sin or wickedness. And so unclean does not mean evil. It does not mean sinful. It's really referring to a person's condition. In fact, in Leviticus chapter 12, we're not going to read this, but we read there that a woman who has just given birth to a child is considered unclean. Well, there's no sin involved with having a child. Well, you see, the word unclean is not really talking about sin, is it? And the same thing is true as we look at these passages about leprosy beginning in chapter 13. Now, you and I tend to use these words in those ways. We talk about unclean and we mean sinful. In fact, did you notice this morning we sang the song, I Stand Amazed, and we said that exact words. I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned unclean. Right? We use that language that way. And we do that with good reason. Again, the parallels are there. The connections are there. But that is not how the word is being used in the books of Moses. These words are also not primarily concerned with sanitation and hygiene. I know a lot of people in our world today, they try to give this kind of explanation to that, and they'll say, well, there are some things that God, through Moses, said, don't do this because it will make you unclean. And now we moderns, we know that, we know about bacteria and germs, and we know about communicable diseases. And so when God said, don't touch this, it makes you unclean, God was just trying to keep them healthy. I don't believe that. I don't think that's the idea. I'm not saying that's not a byproduct of it. But I don't think that was the primary purpose in all of this. The term holy is used so many times in the book of Leviticus. Holiness is more about consecration and usefulness in the Lord's service. Clean and unclean are really speaking more about ritual and ceremonial status of a worshiper or an object. Is this object capable of being used in the Lord's worship? Is this person able to come into God's presence? Is he clean? Is he unclean? So, let's look at these examples. Leviticus chapters 13 and 14 talk about leprosy and how that was dealt with. There were various skin diseases, skin conditions in the Old Testament that made a person unclean. Now, leprosy seems to be more of this generic kind of a term that would have included a lot of different skin rashes or other kinds of issues of the skin, psoriasis, dermatitis, all these things that we know about nowadays. But in Leviticus chapter 13, if you look with me at verse 1, and there's 59 verses in this chapter about how to deal with leprosy and clean or unclean, and we're about to read every one. I'm kidding. We're not going to do that. But we are going to read a few, all right? So let's look at chapter 13 and verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a man has on the skin of his body a swelling or a scab or a bright spot, and it becomes an infection of leprosy on the skin of his body, whoo, man, this is fun already, isn't it? Then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons the priests. Now, the priests are going to investigate this. They're going to look at his skin, and God's going to give them in this chapter some determining factors. Well, if it looks like this, it means that. And if it looks like that, then it means this. And all that's right here in chapter 13. But I want you to look at the end of verse 3. When the priest has looked at him, he shall be pronounced unclean. He has this skin disease, and he is pronounced unclean. Now let me ask you, what sin did this man commit? There's no sin involved here. Again, it's not about sin. It's about condition. It's about status. And so he's pronounced unclean. If you look at verse 4, if the bright spot is white on the skin of his body, and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair on it has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate him who has the infection for 7 days. So we're going to quarantine this man for 7 days, and then we'll reevaluate next week, and we'll see how does it look then. Is it better? Is it worse? And so forth. Verse 5 says, on the 7th day, the priest will look at him again. If it's not any better, isolate him 7 more days. At the end of verse 5, it says. All right. Then at the end of verse 6. At the end of verse 6, when all other conditions have been met, he shall wash his clothes and he will be clean. Okay. So you see this man who has this condition, he's pronounced unclean, but if the condition gets better and he goes through certain procedural elements, he can then be pronounced clean again. And so verses 7 and 8 are going to talk a little bit more about this, but this whole chapter, priests, go look at this man. The man, go to the priest, let him look at you, let him evaluate, and let him make this determination. Now this is just a sampling of verses. This entire chapter gives a number of details about how to deal with this skin disease. But all I want you to see, as you just quickly scan your eyes down through the chapter, look for the words clean and unclean. It's all there, several times. Same thing in chapter 14, clean and unclean. But do look with me at this. Near the end of the chapter 13, look at verse 45. Verse 45. As for the leper who has the infection, his clothes shall be torn, and the hair of his head shall be uncovered, and he shall cover his mustache and cry, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean all the days during which he has the infection. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp. Now, there are some hygiene elements involved in this. Leprosy was believed to be a communicable disease that you could give to somebody else. And so if you have this skin disease and they come into contact with you, they will perhaps get the same disease. And so we need to quarantine. We need to put them outside the camp. And whenever somebody happens to go near the person with leprosy, the leprous person is supposed to cover their mouth. Your translation might say cover his mustache. He's supposed to cover his mouth and say, unclean. He doesn't want to spread this disease. He doesn't want people coming too close to him. There's no sin involved. But in that condition, he is not able to come into the presence of God. He is not able to worship with all of the others. He is not able to be a part of the camp because of his condition. If you were clean yourself, but you touched a person with leprosy, guess what? You became unclean yourself. Even if you didn't contract the disease, you are unclean. All right, well, let's go to chapter 15 now. Let's move on from leprosy, and let's talk about something that's a little more unsettling. Let's just keep going, right? We're already down this track. We're committed now. Let's just keep on going. Look at chapter 15. This will remind you, perhaps, of my sermon from 3 weeks ago. From Mark chapter 5, when we talked about that woman who had the hemorrhage, and she came up and touched the garment of Jesus. Okay? This is the passage that would have applied to her. So Leviticus chapter 15, look at verse 25. If a woman has a discharge of her blood many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, all the days of her discharge she shall continue as though she is in her menstrual impurity. She is unclean. Any bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her like her bed at menstruation. Everything on which she sits shall be unclean, like her. Okay, what sin is involved? None. She's not done anything wrong, but she has a hemorrhage, and she can't control that. But what's her condition? She's unclean. Anything that she sits on is unclean. It is affected. She makes it unclean by virtue of her own uncleanness. No sin is involved, though. Now, you connect that to the woman we discussed 3 weeks ago. The woman who had this hemorrhage for 12 years. You remember that story? This poor woman has been pronounced unclean for 12 years. Verse 27 continues, likewise, whoever touches them, that is the bed and the clothes and whatever other linens, bed sheets that she may have sat upon, whoever touches them shall be unclean, and shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. You notice the thing that is unclean, if it's a person with leprosy, if it's a woman with this discharge, there are other forms of discharges, male and female, discussed here in this chapter. If you have those conditions, you are unclean. But if you touch something, if you touch someone else, those things also become unclean. All right. One more, okay? Stay with me. I know this is kind of like, hey, I didn't eat a breakfast that would prepare me for this, Ben. Okay, one more. Let's go to the book of Numbers now. Numbers chapter 19. I'm looking at these examples for a reason. There are other examples of things that would make a person unclean, but I've chosen these for a reason. And trust me, all this work that we're doing in Leviticus and Numbers, it's all going to pay off here in just a little while, okay? Numbers chapter 19. Start reading with me in verse 11. Verse 11. Anyone who touches the corpse of any person shall be unclean for 7 days. Okay, so if you touch a dead body, maybe you're a doctor, you're a physician, and you come to check on this sick person who is near the point of death. Once they have died, you've got to go through burial procedures and dispose of that body. If you're a doctor, you're probably going to be affected by this law. If you're the undertaker who comes to retrieve that deceased person, you have to pick them up. You have to put them on the wagon. You have to roll them out of town. There's a lot of ways that somebody could come into contact with a dead body. And so what provisions are made there? Well, if you do that, the verse says, you'll be unclean for 7 days. Now, verse 12, the one shall purify himself from uncleanness with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd and the 7th day, he will not be clean. Anyone who touches a corpse, the body of a man who has died, and does not purify himself, he defiles the tabernacle of the Lord. And that person shall be cut off from Israel, because the water for impurity was not sprinkled on him. He shall be unclean, and his uncleanness remains on him. Okay, you continue on. You see some more that is said about this idea. If you touch a dead body, you become unclean, and there is a purification rite that you must follow. Okay, enough of that, right? Let's get away from that now, okay? Now let's look at some other things. I want you to turn with me to 2 Chronicles chapter 23. This is a summation statement of any person who is considered unclean. 2 Chronicles 23. There are some religious reforms that are taking place through Jehoiada. And among them, these reforms that are being carried out, chapter 23 and verse 16, Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and all the people and the king that they would be the Lord's people. Jehoiada is a priest. Joash is the king, but Jehoiada is leading the effort of this restoration. And so verse 17, all the people went to the house of Baal and they tore it down, and they broke in pieces Baal's altars and his images, and they killed Mattan the priest of Baal before the altars. Moreover, Jehoiada placed the offices of the house of the Lord under the authority of the Levitical priests, whom David had assigned over the house of the Lord to offer the burnt offerings to the Lord, as it is written in the law of Moses, with rejoicing and singing according to the order of David. He stationed the gatekeepers of the house of the Lord, look at this, so that no one could enter who was in any way unclean. Okay. If you were unclean, for whatever reason, you could not come into the temple of the Lord for worship. Not in that condition. And so you must wait for your situation to change, go through the rituals of purification, become clean again, and then you can come into the presence of the Lord. But I just used this passage to say there were no exceptions to this. If you were unclean, you were not allowed into the assembly. Now I want to look at one more Old Testament passage, and then we're going to go to the New Testament, and let's talk about Jesus. So I want you to turn with me to Haggai chapter 2. All of this is going to come together right here in Haggai chapter 2. Clean becomes unclean, unclean becoming clean. All this comes together right here. Haggai chapter 2. We begin in verse 10 to set the stage, to give us the time frame. So verse 10 says, "On the 24th of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to Haggai the prophet, saying, Thus says the Lord, ask now the priests for a ruling." So Haggai is going to go to the priests, and he's going to present them with a hypothetical scenario. Two, actually. And he wants them to give their judgment. So in chapter 2 and verse 12, if a man carries holy meat. Now, what is holy meat? That would be meat that had been offered in a sacrifice. You remember from our study of the book of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers a few quarters back, that in the sacrifices, oftentimes a portion of that animal sacrifice was given to the priests for food. And that was called the holy meat. Okay? So, if a man carries holy meat in the fold of his garment, so the priestly robes had, we would think of them as pockets. Okay? And a man might take that holy meat, maybe I've offered several sacrifices today. I've eaten a good bit. I'm not really hungry anymore, but I'm taking this portion of the meat, and so he's going to put that in his Tupperware, and he's going to put that in his pocket. Okay? He's going to wrap it up in tin foil and put it in his pocket. Well, when that holy, purified meat, consecrated meat, touches his robe, what happens to his robe? It's clean. It's now clean. Wow. Okay. So the cleanliness, the purity of the meat is now on the robe. So Haggai says, if a man carries holy meat in the fold of his garment, and then with that fold of garment touches bread or cooked food, wine, oil, or any other food, will it become holy? Will the man's clean robe cleanse these other food items? And the priest said, no, it doesn't work like that. The priest's garment becomes clean, but not what his garment touches. No, it doesn't transfer the cleanliness like that. Okay? Well, now Haggai presents another hypothetical. Verse 13. If one who is unclean from a corpse touches any of those food items, back from verse 12. Cooked food, wine, oil, okay. If a man who touches a corpse touches any of these, will the food items become unclean? You know the answer. This man has touched a corpse, which means he is now what? He's unclean. And now in his unclean condition, he goes and touches these food items, and the priest said, yes, those food items become unclean. Okay. Here's what I want you to see with all of this, because I can see some of you like the eyes are glazing over and you're kind of thinking, why are we talking about this, preacher? Where are you going with this? Okay. You notice in these two scenarios, the purity of the garment with the meat in it does not spread to the foods that they touch. But the impurity, the uncleanness of the man who touched the corpse, that does spread. Okay? So here's the main point of all these passages that we've looked at. Okay? So right here it is. You say, man, okay, we've done all that work and I'm still not tracking with you. Here's where we bring it all together. Whenever contact occurs, whether it's between people or objects, when contact occurs, that which is clean always becomes unclean. If you are clean, but you touch someone who's unclean, you become unclean. Your cleanness doesn't spread to them. Their uncleanness spreads to you. You see that? The impurity spreads, not the purity. So let me give you a couple of simple illustrations. I know you're with me, but let me just give you these helpful illustrations. You can catch a cold from a sick person. You cannot catch health from a well person. Does that make sense? Yeah? When I go out and change the oil in my truck, my hands get dirty. And if I come into the house and I touch something, when I have grease and dirt and grime on my hands, I will leave a dirty mark on that surface. But when I touch that surface with clean hands, I don't leave a clean mark. Right? Okay, that's the simple idea. It's always the impurity that spreads, not the purity. Now, where am I going with this? Why am I talking about all of this? All right, think about where we started. We started with a miracle of Jesus. And what happens when we come to the New Testament is Jesus inverts this. He flips it. He changes it. You see, Jesus, when he touched, he never became unclean. But he cleansed that which was unclean. No one else in the history of human existence had that ability. But Jesus could make the unclean clean. So can I show you some examples? And you remember all those passages in Leviticus and Numbers we looked at? We looked at leprosy, we looked at the discharge of blood, and we looked at the corpse. I picked those three for a reason. Because in the ministry of Jesus, we see him touching all three of those people. All right, so Mark chapter 1. Let's go there again. That's where we started. Mark chapter 1. I've been reading the miracles from Mark's gospel lately. And so you understand now why my last couple of sermons have been about miracles in the gospel of Mark. But in Mark chapter 1, the leper says to Jesus in verse 40, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus, it says in verse 41, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Look at that. Who throughout all of Jewish history was ever willing to touch a man with leprosy? And doesn't that add something to the leper's question? Lord, if you are willing, nobody else is willing to even come near me. But if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus touches him. And I am sure that there would be others who would have seen Jesus touch people with leprosy and say, "Oh, can you believe what he just did? Oh, he's unclean." Well, wait a minute. Wait, whoa. Hey, did you see what he just did? Right? If you are willing. And Jesus will do that. Go to chapter 5. Two examples right here in this chapter. I'm not going to go through the story of the woman that we talked about 3 weeks ago again. We're not going to look at that story again. But I do just want to point out the fact that there was contact in between this woman and Jesus. She sneaks up behind him in the crowd and she says to herself in verse 28, "If I can just touch him, I will be made well." And then Jesus knows that someone touched him. He says that in verse 30. And he says it again in verse 31, or the disciples say that. What do you mean, who touched you? The point is there was contact between Jesus and an unclean person. Jesus is supposed to be unclean now, but he's not. In fact, his purity purifies the unclean woman. Now, right here in chapter 5, do you remember that a man named Jairus came to Jesus and said, "Lord, my daughter is sick. Please come with me." And so Jesus began walking with Jairus to go to his house and to heal his daughter. And then this woman comes in and she interrupts the parade. And when all of that is finally dealt with, now look in Mark chapter 5 and verse 35. While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" Now Jesus knows what he is going to do. He encourages people. He says in verse 36, "Do not be afraid, but believe." And he comes to the house in verse 38. He saw a commotion and people were weeping loudly and wailing. And entering in, verse 39, he said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep." Now, Jesus knows that the child is dead. He does this in John 11 with Lazarus too. Lazarus isn't dead, he's only sleeping. Well, he'd been sleeping for 4 days, Jesus. Okay, Jesus knows. He's trying to help them see, though, that it's going to be as if she was only sleeping. You will see what I'm about to do. And so, verse 40, they began to laugh at him because he said she was only asleep. But he put all of them outside. He took along the child's father and mother and his own companions, and he entered the room where the child was, taking the child by the hand. He touched the corpse. And he said to her, "Talitha cum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old, and immediately they were completely astounded. He touched the dead body, but he doesn't become unclean. You see, Jesus flips on its head everything that the law of Moses said about clean and unclean. His touch purifies. His touch cleanses that which is unclean. I want to throw in something that I just thought about. That's kind of dangerous, but I'm going to do it anyways because I feel pretty confident about this. I want you to go with me to Isaiah chapter 6, and let's look at something here. Isaiah chapter 6. I know what I'm about to say to you is true. That's why I don't hesitate to go to it. When I say it just entered my mind, though, as I was doing my sermon prep this week, I didn't think about this passage. But, it really makes the point. Isaiah chapter 6, you remember that Isaiah here, he sees this vision of the Almighty on his throne. And he says in verse 5, when he sees God, he says, "Woe is me, for I am ruined, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, because my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." When you see the King, you know that you're a sinner. When I see the King, I see His holiness and His power and His beauty and glory, and I see that I don't have those things. That's what Isaiah is saying to us. I am unclean. But look at what happens. Verse 6, "One of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal in his hand, which he had taken from the altar with tongs, and he touched my mouth with it, and he said, 'Behold, this has touched your lips, and your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is forgiven.'" One of the angels, one of the seraphim, who sent that angel to Isaiah? Where did he get that burning coal from the altar in heaven? Well, that came from God, right? God sent him. God provided the means for Isaiah to be cleansed. Here's the point I want to make with you. When God touches people, people are cleansed, now connected to Jesus. What does Isaiah 6 teach us about Jesus? When He touches people and they are cleansed, it teaches us the same thing that Isaiah 6 does, and that is that Jesus is God. Beloved, when God touches us, God cleanses us. Now, let's go back to the New Testament. And let's pursue that just a little bit more. Hebrews chapter 9. Hebrews chapter 9. The writer here is going to tell us about the old covenant and what was made possible, but how much more the new covenant in Jesus is greater. Hebrews chapter 9, look with me at verse 13. Hebrews 9, verse 13. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer, sprinkling those who have been defiled, sanctify for the cleansing of the flesh, if this is what was there under the Old Testament economy, now verse 14 gives a contrast. How much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God? You see, there's a contrast here, too, actually, not only between old law and new law of Christ, but the old law, those sacrifices cleansed the flesh of those who were unclean. You touched a corpse, you had to wait 7 days, you had to wash with water, you had to offer sacrifices, then your flesh became clean. You had a bloody discharge, you had to go through these rituals, then your flesh became clean. But the writer of Hebrews says Jesus doesn't stop with the flesh. Jesus cleanses the conscience. He cleanses the heart and the mind. With Jesus, when He touches us, He takes away our sin. He takes away our guilt. He takes away our shame. The blood of Jesus goes far deeper than ritual cleansing to cleanse my flesh. His power cleanses and purifies my conscience, something that no animal blood sacrifice could ever do. And so I want to close now with this passage in 1 Peter chapter 3. Peter talks about this very idea, the cleansing of the conscience that's given through Jesus. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21, Peter says, talking about Noah's flood and the new life that came on the other side of the flood water. He says, corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Peter says that when we are baptized in water, we are not taking a bath. We are not washing dirt off of our bodies. We are not trying to become clean from having just touched a corpse or having touched blood or something like that. That's not what it's about. Peter says that baptism is the point in which the blood of Christ cleanses the conscience. That's what we read about in Hebrews 9. The power of His blood to take away my guilt, to take away my shame, to give me a clean conscience, to give me a fresh start, and give me a new life in Jesus Christ. And Peter says, yes, and let me tell you when that happens. It happens in the waters. It happens when you rise to walk in newness of life. You see, Jesus makes clean that which is unclean. He did it with His touch for so many that He saw when He was walking the earth. And now He does it through His blood for any and all who wish to come to Him and receive a clean conscience. So what about you this morning? Do you need that cleansing blood of Jesus? Have you been baptized into Christ to rise and walk in newness of life, free of sin, free of guilt, free of shame, becoming a new man, becoming a new woman in Jesus? Can we help you with that this morning? We would love nothing more than to see you obey the gospel today. And if we can help you do that, we invite you. Come to the front now while we stand together and sing.